Bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charles Cloutier, and I'm the head of operations for the Forum of Federations. The Forum of Federations is an international organization based in Ottawa, and it works with its partners in a global network on issues of federalism and decentralized governance. It is my pleasure to present this webinar on linguistic policy in Canada to you, and we'll be looking at an update on progress. This is part of a consultation process that began in 2020 within the Forum, and it marks the publication of a new document on linguistic policy in Canada and in federal structures. This webinar will also give you an introduction to some of the research done by Cardinal and Miranda Huron as part of this report on linguistic policy in Canada is well established, but there is room for improvement. This is very important given the reforms that are currently in process, and since linguistic laws are often controversial. I will be serving as Mr. Graham Fraser will be moderating this webinar. Between 2006 and 2007, he was the Commissioner for Official Languages in Canada. And he worked to ensure the recognition of the status of official languages and worked with legislators on federal administration around official languages, promoting French and the place of languages in Canadian society. Before being named as commissioner, he was an international affairs journalist with the Toronto Star between 2000 and 2006. Throughout his career, Mr. Fraser has written about Canadian and Quebecois language policy, as well as politics on the international level and in the United States. He also worked for Maclean's, the Globe and Mail, the Gazette, across Toronto, Montreal, Quebec, Washington, and elsewhere. He also worked as an official chronicler at a Montreal newspaper. He has published several books, including The Fate of Canada, a journal of the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. In 1992, he was the first recipient of the Hyman Solomon Award for Excellence in Public Policy Journalism. Graham studied at the University of Toronto, where he is the recipient of 5 honorary doctorates. He is also a senior fellow at the Higher School of International Affairs in Ottawa, and is part of the board of the McGill Research Board. So without further delay, Graham Fraser, you have the floor. Thank you very much. Graham, your microphone is not on.
Merci beaucoup, Charles.
So sorry. Thank you, Charles.
Customary at sessions like this to begin with an Indigenous land acknowledgement. However, given that the event is taking place virtually, this will be a virtual acknowledgement. Je crois qu'aujourd'hui, nous devons reconnaître les contributions importantes.
Today, I would like to recognize the important contributions of Indigenous people in Canada, especially because the text we will be discussing today has a lot to say about Indigenous languages, alongside French and English. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you the 2 authors of this study on Canadian language policy. Linda Cardinal is a professor and administrator at the University of French Ontario, and she has been since 2021. She is also a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Ottawa. She specializes in linguistic policy, and we've had the pleasure of working together on a panel at TFO.
Is the Director of Indigenous Education and Affairs at Capilano University and is the former Director of Language and Culture at the Assembly of First Nations, where she co-developed the Indigenous Languages Act. Mesdames, à vous la parole.
Ladies, you have the floor. Thank you. Thank you, Graham. And thank you for giving this virtual recognition. It's very important, not only to recognize Indigenous territorial claims, but also Indigenous contributions to Canadian history. I'm going to share my screen. And in this presentation, it has the same title as our report, Linguistic Policy, checking in on progress. The goal of our presentation today is to tell you about our report and also to open up a space for dialogue. This is something the Forum has been doing around linguistic policies around the world in federal systems, but especially in Canada, because I think that our collaboration with Miranda and I would like to thank the Forum for supporting our work together, which allowed Miranda and I to meet and to open up this dialogue about official languages, especially French and Indigenous languages and their status. And we hope to continue in this work in the near future. Our presentation today is pretty straightforward. We want to tell you a little bit about our report. We're not going to present everything that's in the report to you, just the main ideas. And we'll go a little bit into the analytical framework that we used. I think that's important for this kind of work. We'll talk about some of the challenges we identified. And in our report, it was divided into three primary sections. First, a summary of the actual situation on the ground, because in any situation, you have to start with the data. And when we wanted to know more about the linguistic groups we were discussing, and to recognize the diversity that already exists within Canada, especially in terms of Indigenous languages. We also give a fast overview of some of the ongoing debates about language policy, some recent changes, and then introduce reforms that are under consideration and analyze some of the different issues that are at stake. Now, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Miranda, who is going to tell us about the first main points in the text, namely the idea that the recognition framework in Canada is based on three specific elements. So, Miranda, over to you before I speak any longer. And then I'll come back a little later to talk more about language policy. Over to you, Miranda.
For taking the introduction there. It's a pleasure to be amongst all of you speaking here today. And I wanted to speak to with the idea of the compromise for language policy, as well as the hierarchies that get developed and working through federalism. When we look at, for example, within the Indigenous Languages Act, the core tenets that came through from that negotiation was affirmation of the Indigenous languages rights within our Constitution, within Section 35, and an acknowledgement of the past wrongs that happened and ongoing that continue to suppress our languages. We also worked on receiving financial support to revive and bring forth our languages once more, and the ability to enter into agreements with the provinces to support our languages, as well as a language commissioner. Now, when we look at those areas, all of them are always put into a scope of within acknowledging the official languages and their priorities. And so there's always going to be this compromise that exists as we work through what is it to be a multilingual country. When we think about where Indigenous languages rights came from, initially there was the push for suppression and elimination until we were finally protected within the Multiculturalism Act, although only as a theory. And so we are constantly having to work within this hierarchy of English having the dominant role within our culture and being sort of put at odds with the French language, which is unfortunate because we're coming from similar spaces. But this is core tenets to how Canada works as a country. Within the Indigenous work that we do, we are set there to aspire to French rights, but we can't negotiate from a standpoint of what it would look like to have the goal of Indigenous languages as a first language and that immersion space that is so powerful within the Official Languages Act. And further acknowledging how, even within the Official Languages Act, how the French languages does not have the same level of care and attention that is required for it to thrive in this space. Which brings us to that space where we are allowed to negotiate within the provinces. And so once again, this seems to be reflected as well within the French language, or French language as a minority language space, where it is an ongoing issue of having to work through each individual province to acknowledge rights, to work through the courts to ensure that those rights are exist and are supported. And with that, I'm going to hand this back over to Linda to speak through the timelines of how language legislation has happened in Canada.
Merci Miranda. Alors, comme Miranda l'a mentionné, il y a un cadre.
Yes, as Miranda said, there is a framework for recognition in Canada based on 3 elements. And it's always part of a political compromise, whether that be between 2 dominant populations, French speakers and English speakers, or in between different Indigenous languages and the French and English on the other side. And we're always making compromises. And sometimes it's like trying to square the circle, because we want to make language rights real and effective, especially for Indigenous populations, but too often on the ground, this approach of going compromise by compromise just really seems to slow things down. And we can see that with federalism, which is in charge of applying this linguistic policy. And for Indigenous people and First Nations, even though protecting their language rights is a federal responsibility, the collaboration around these rights is sometimes difficult between the federal government and the provinces in these communities. And we would like to talk to you about our research on these issues. Miranda and I could never have imagined how important this dialogue would wind up being for Canada. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about the ranking, the hierarchization of languages in Canada. And here you have some important dates for establishing the official languages of Canada. In the first generation of linguistic policy, the scope was very limited. There were a lot of good intentions. We wanted to recognize languages in the Canadian Constitution of 1867. So it's French and English, and the right to use either of them is guaranteed. And they are established as the languages of the courts. But of course, that requires translation and interpretation. And it was only in the 1950s that those services began to be widely available. So once again, you have laws saying one thing, but on the ground, the application remains difficult. We also must remember that behind the Constitution of 1867, there were the momentum of state and of tradition behind this approach to official languages. And as a kind of compromise, once again, we adopted French and English, the official languages everyone knows. And this gave both Anglophone and Francophone Canadians rights to receive public services in French or in English from the federal government and from federal institutions. This also means that Francophones and Anglophones have a right to equal representation at the federal level. But in 1969, there were certain groups who started calling for the recognition of Indigenous languages as well. And in 1982, 1988, those are important dates because in the history of Canadian linguistic policy, there was greater and greater equality between French and English as official languages. And at this time in the 1980s, the approach was to recognize linguistic rights, and that was all added to the Constitution, more information about these rights. But there wasn't so much done to protect Indigenous languages. It took another new generation of linguistic policy for more recognition for Indigenous languages. And in 2019, we finally have a law on the recognition of Indigenous languages. So in 1867, this couldn't even be envisioned. It was French and English who were established as official languages, and later things began to open up. People began to be able to receive services in French outside of Quebec, even though there were still practical issues. And this kind of administrative approach is quite interesting from a policy standpoint, because it really was a slow progress, bit by bit. And it really shows the difference between multilingualism in policy and multilingualism in practice. And it's kind of incredible for someone from Ontario to have French on their driver's license. That's a big step forward, even though we think we're still quite far behind. There has been some progress that's been made. There have been compromises, as Miranda said. And then in 1982 and 1988, why 1988? Because when we had a new law for official languages, but during this time, there were also major changes in the provinces. Ontario adopted a law on providing services in French. And this had started happening at the provincial level in the 60s, but you also have new laws about equality between the two major linguistic communities. We also must remember that Quebec adopted its law 101 at the end of the 60s, but that led to major changes in terms of language use in front of the Supreme Court. And when you move from one generation to the next, we are always recognizing more and better. And we're always looking for political compromises to create new obligations, because that's what laws are for. And legislators need to create the tools, need to give themselves the tools they need to enact these laws effectively. So, and then 2019, 2022, that was like the big test of all of these new laws and policies. Because we had a law that did in fact create new obligations, and that was based on principles like creating real equality between different communities. And that was the new law on official languages, which called for recognition of the minority status of French in North America and in Canada, and also the law on Indigenous languages, as Miranda said, created new obligations, an obligation to finance the protection of the linguistic rights of Indigenous people. There was the creation of the role of commissioner. And this idea that we are now creating new obligations, but still bit by bit, we do run into certain challenges. And those challenges arise not only from the trouble of coordinating the relationships between different communities and these new changes, there are also theoretical issues that Miranda and I came across. Because in each case, in each generation, there are different ideas of how these compromises should work and how federalism and this hierarchization of languages should work and should be felt. But with each generation, our linguistic policy in Canada gets deeper, gets stronger. And what we want to do is try to better describe the possibilities for change that do exist within the linguistic system in place. And also, how might these changes really shake up existing power relationships and allow people to question this ranking, this hierarchy between French and English and Indigenous languages. And hopefully we can rebalance these power relationships, perhaps even eliminate them. So these changes can only take place in quite particular contexts. And one of the theoretical advancements that we're trying to do, one of the contributions we're trying to make, is discussing more this challenge of wanting to move forward with linguistic policy, even with all of the little problems that exist within it. So I'll hand it back over to my colleague Miranda, who will talk about the progress that we've made in terms of obligations and rights for Indigenous language speakers, as well as some of the challenges we've come across in terms of linguistic policy.
You know, when we talk about path dependency, you know, we've been bringing up this Canada's historic path dependency of being initially very Anglocentric and then moving into a view of being bilingual for all intents and purposes. It presents itself as a bilingual nation despite French remaining within this minority shell. And then not at all acknowledging Indigenous languages until now. And to create that shift within that path dependency was a massive struggle. It took that concept of nation-to-nation policy development to really clue into what is it to co-develop policy, and how is it that we do policy within a frame of reconciliation. And so when we look at that, it requires changes. It requires taking Indigenous policy informants who are giving advice on policy and shifting that lens to having Indigenous policy actors. Even within that framework, it's still highly problematic, as there continues to be areas such as cabinet confidentiality, where major decisions are made, and within the Department of Justice and the writing of the legislation, the drafting of the legislation, where all of the defining of what Indigenous views of what our future is for our languages can be shifted by voices that don't have us at the table. And this is something that as a government that is evolving and trying to look at reconciliation in depth, we'll have to really deeply consider what does it mean when we're working nation to nation. And some of us may be aware of that concept of true wampum, where you have governing bodies working side by side, and the respect that comes from that sort of parallel relationship where we can inform each other's work so that we're not overlapping and continuing the history of oppression that has affected our languages. So when we look at this concept, what we're clearly having to deal with is that defining of what is it that we want for our languages. When we look at French minority languages or the smaller quantity of English minority languages, what are we doing to think about regionalism within our policy framework, and what are we doing to recognize the needs and how communities are defining the way they want to speak their language. All of these require deeper conversations and deeper turning points within our policy history. I think we move over to the next slide. Oh, not too far. So, when we look at federalism in the government, one of the things that has become a major conflict for us within this creation of federalism and the government, Federalism for Languages Act, is that continuously Indigenous populations remain in that federal frame, despite the fact that education, health, the justice system, all of these places that are completely intrinsic to what it is to speak a language, to the safety within language, to how things are governed within languages. These happen within the provincial frame. And so when we look at Canada's current working on how we can create language legislation, there isn't that ongoing communication with the provinces and territories. Indigenous legislation in the territorial and provincial frame has been done in a very ad hoc manner. And we see that as well with the French framing, where rights that are in one don't, with French, it's more so whether or not there's an acknowledgement of bilingualism and whatnot. With Indigenous languages, it ranges from recognition to what you have in Nunavut with the full slate of rights. When we were developing the Indigenous Languages Act, for example, there was challenges within that act where Nunavut, who has the most advanced language legislation, was dependent on that legislation to recognize the differences between the needs of the varying needs of First Nation languages and the needs of the Michif language, the Métis language. And that diversity within the legislation, the distinction-based element within the legislation, unfortunately did not truly come through. And so we see territorial language legislation that is far more advanced than the federal legislation, and that disconnect for Indigenous populations means that we're at a struggle with what our rights actually are, and it returns us again to the courts processes, which we wind up spending 10, 20 years trying to renegotiate, where the reality is for Indigenous languages, we don't have 10, 20 years. The core speakers of our languages are sitting in that 60 plus frame. We do have new young speakers coming in, which is a change because this generation doesn't carry that first generation trauma of the residential schools. And so there isn't that fear of speaking your language, but that transmission that was meant to happen between parents and children did not. And with the elders getting to such an age, it becomes very scary for us with the potential of even maintaining our languages into the future. So having these conversations around how we can have that connection between the federal level and the provincial level really highlights that critical need that we also see within French language, where there's also is not that that dialogue happening. Back to you, Linda.
Merci, Miranda. Je vais juste poursuivre.
Thank you, Miranda. I'm going to continue on the fact that we have a number of mandates. So, of course, there are quite a few questions that can be raised, and this constitutes an interesting research field. So, what's happening in a Canadian federalism context in order to launch this dialogue within a reconciliation dialogue, in order to understand clearly what's happening when we talk about French as a native context, First Nations and the Quebec.
Très dommage que dans le nouveau projet de loi 85.
Of course, it would be too bad that no reference is made to the native languages. And that is why, in our discussion, Miranda and I, we try to build bridges between Francophones, Anglophones, autochthonous populations. So the First Nation are still confronted to this bilingualism framework, and we are often wondering whether that is really of great interest to serve reconciliation. So there are Francophone autochthonous people who are paying the price for this contradiction between French and English. So we are still thinking about that. And it's difficult to look at this linguistic challenge. So there is a work of reconciliation that is considerable. In order for that to be achieved, there is need for more research. And of course, we both are interested in federalism, because within the framework of the 219 piece of legislation, there is a need for this type of collaboration. And within the other context, this issue of federal laws and provincial laws. So there is a need to look into French outside Quebec or English. And we've seen that in media recently. This question was raised, and the Federation of Francophone Communities of Canada would suggest a more constrainous framework. And undoubtedly, from a practical point of view, this is where we need to go into this test much more than in a piece of legislation. The other element which we tackled in our discussion, we often talk about the educational issue as a fundamental one. And as you know, this is quite important for Francophone minorities. They're often in tribunals contesting why in certain provinces they prohibit the building of new schools, while laws justify that. So here we identified a common ground to share good practices, to share reflection, to share experience of our relationships with our provincial governments in order to support one another. And by reading our text, I hope you will get a feeling of the importance of this element. We also have a long experience in this area. Here there is space for research and comparative study. Also, there is a shortage of teachers. We learn that there is a shortage of teachers. So we keep repeating that. For teaching French, there is a shortage of people. Same thing for autochthonous languages. So how can we do more research on this issue? The governance of education needs to be looked at within the Canadian federalism, and this requires a special attention. Generally speaking, it is also the philosophy of official languages that needs to be modified. So there is certainly an opportunity to think about how to improve this situation. What do Native people need in order to have a better situation? Miranda and I looked into this, and we feel that there is some research that shows that this has been tackled. Of course, this is an interesting example of the importance of languages for the well-being of a community. And we can even talk about the linguistic well-being in Canada. The Anglophones of Quebec, the Francophones in Quebec, the autochthonous peoples. So they all need to find themselves within a notion of linguistic well-being so as to support one another. So for Miranda and I, there is a need to do research in this window. There are students, Francophone, Anglophone, who need to find themselves in order to go in depth into this. This is really a kind of advocacy which I'm doing for research. So we finish our presentation on this type of advocacy. So once again, thank you for being with us.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much to both of you for a fascinating summary of your very rich paper. I very much appreciated your overview and analysis. D'abord, Linda, une question très générale.
First of all, Linda, this is a generic question. In Quebec, there is a very sober discourse as concerns the language barrier. So looks like Law 101 was a failure. Not only that. Now, would you say you are optimistic or pessimistic for the future of French in Canada? I don't even know whether we should talk about optimism or. I think there is a given context, there is a given discourse, which is linked to the constitutional framework. So today, French is debated in a different context, within the context of globalization. So in this specific context, we cannot say, or at least some people may not adhere to the thesis that French is threatened. When you are in a country in North America with 150 million, I think one should have a worry. One should be vigilant. That is why we have laws. Under autochthonous laws, we are in a vulnerable situation. So that is why we're talking about the need for revitalization. In a world such as ours, we need to have a philosophy of unilingualism. And we always think of English by saying, why would languages feel threatened? So I think we should look into the context. And in the current context, the proposed law of Madame Espatino says that we recognize that French in a minority situation in North America, which is vulnerable in comparison with English in North America. So maybe Frédéric Lacroix has a different approach, but in this context, we take into account what is in the context. So laws have somewhat lost their efficacy. They need to be modernized so that there be further progress. Some data have been put on the table, showing that you have this, that methodology. But I think there are surveys and investigations which show that there is an increase in support for autochthonous languages. So I think we should stop at this level, look into this data, and consider that bilingualism is important for our country. If we say that French is threatened, there is no vulnerability. In any case, English economically is more interesting. This is something that could be said in certain contexts. So this is not very important from the point of view of identity, but if you accumulate all these arguments, certainly you're going to say, well, my God, this is not possible. This is not really. So I think this is the context in which we find ourselves. And it can be the foundation for the attitude that we may adopt vis-a-vis French or English.
Miranda, let me ask you a version of the same question. You've looked carefully at the number of initiatives to protect and promote Indigenous languages. There are some, the numbers always vary, 50 or 100 Indigenous languages, 3 major Indigenous language groups in Canada, variety of pieces of legislation that have been introduced in the different jurisdictions. At this point, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
You know, when I look at the unbelievable work that has continued to be done by people working in the languages with shoestring budgets and just that desire to keep our languages going, you know, I have to sit in the realm of positivity. You know, we've come through a history of linguistic oppression. We've come through the languages, you know, the abuses just for speaking languages. And when we look at the fact that these languages are still beginning to thrive again, that there are youth who are wanting to learn their languages, how can you not feel positive? I had the good luck of working with Addie Point, who is an elder down at Musqueam, and she was the first speaker of her language. And while I was working with her, I was also learning Hunkaminam, the Musqueam language, with Elder Larry Grant, and he was lucky to have not gone to residential school, which meant that he sat at the table of his grandparents and was listening to the language as a child. And in taking that language class, all of these memories started to come back. And so despite when Addie unfortunately passed away over 20 years ago, despite that immense loss to the languages, there was that hidden seed of language within Larry Grant that just blossomed. And he's now, he speaks everywhere in his language. And so these are the miracles of language and how we can make them come right at the moment where we think that maybe we're losing it. It's still there. And so, you know, there are things that can be done. There are plenty of spaces where our languages have been recorded, and we need access to those spaces. We need access to those resources because, you know, despite those instances, we are at a crisis point with our languages, but you have to remain positive. these languages are nowhere else in the world. So we need to keep them going.
Linda, tout récemment, le gouvernement a déposé...
Linda, recently the government suggested to look into this piece of law 13. You say in the text that the application of new measures on the actual equality may be confronted to some political difficulties. Could you possibly elaborate? What challenges were you referring to? Under Canadian law and under the Supreme Law, there are rulings on this concept. This concept is also used by women groups in terms of linguistic rights. So how can the implementation, if we want to modernize 1982 law, we say that the objectives is that the problem is the implementation. So the same thing here. I think that somewhere the war in Ukraine has focused the attention on what's taking place in Europe, in Ukraine, and thus we have neglected other problem areas. So we had more than now before the proposed law. Now, how is this going to be concretely reflected? What are the measures? I know that the government has the intention to ensure an actual equality. Now, how are we going to use this momentum in order to do an analysis of the policies on equality? How can this be implemented and in the same time promote real equality? For example, when we say that the government should recognize that we need to increase the presence of French as a diplomacy language, this is the principle of equal equality. So we are targeting a language so that it can catch up with the other. So this is a way of doing the other way around. Then we need to promote French as a scientific language. So definitely it will need some promotion so as to be a science language. Sometimes you do a lot more promotion than intended. So in this context, certain universities have done quite a bit. While 90% of the researchers publish in French, now it's 90% of the researchers who publish in English. So this can pose a problem. So this is where we raise this principle of equal, real equality. So the principle of interpretation of linguistic rights. There's also a court ruling that indicates that in certain cases, there may be a differentiated relationship if it is for helping real equality, not just formal equality, but there may be some resistance within the public service because the government looks at this aspect as well. And you need to do some work vis-à-vis the civil servants so that they can develop this reflex.
Before I'm going to ask a question to Miranda and then ask Charles Breton to make a presentation. But in the meantime, I would ask all of those who are watching or listening to prepare questions to submit that I will then ask when I see them on the chat line. Miranda, you described the recent Indigenous language legislation as a panacea for wounds rather than a solution to the crisis of Indigenous languages in Canada. What do you see as the most important steps that need to be taken to heal the wounds?
So the legislation is merely one tool. The work that needs to be done for language revitalization, that comes from the nations. And so what really makes changes is essentially for governance structures to, putting it bluntly, get out of our way. There's a definite need for funding, and that's one of the greatest things that the government can provide. We see what the resources and how that changes things for language minorities to ensure that we can have language in our schools, so that schools on reserve where we get immersion teachings can start moving beyond grade 4 education. The ability for us to start looking at, start increasing our teacher levels. Linda brought that up earlier. Without enough teachers, creating that, your youth are at school 8 hours a day, so you need that interlinguistic transfer between parent and child. But without that school element, it's just so challenging. And so when we look through what can be done, that collaboration that happens with the provinces and the territories and the federal government to really ensure that nations can ensure that laws that are established by the nations can be supported by laws that exist within the provinces and the provinces, territories, and the feds, language laws, that is. And also to break down some of the barriers that happen when we try to really make moves in our areas of language revitalization. And we are seeing those changes, as Linda brought up, with the school districts, the Indigenous school districts that are growing, school boards, sorry, and that self-governance that is happening. But it's really up to the nations to define what they want their languages to look like. Is that immersion? Is that bilingualism? Is it Indigenous language as a second language? That's not up to us to decide. That's up to the nations themselves to decide. That's up to the speakers to know what they want from their language. But we also have to be aware that we are creating barriers as a country for people to make those decisions fully from their heart.
Thank you, Miranda. Before we proceed further with opening up to questions, Charles Breton has a presentation. Charles, est-ce que vous pouvez faire votre présentation?
Oui, tout à fait. Merci. Je veux remercier le Forum des fédérations pour m'avoir invité à commenter sur le papier.
Thank you for this. I must say that the forum did a great job. The series is quite interesting to see in a context of federalism. So what you did, it was a good job, so congratulations. I have two general comments. You have done an exceptional work. You looked at the linguistic landscape, and you've been able to tackle both the policy on official languages, the role of French, that of the autochthonous languages, how the two play a role in society. So personally, I am not an expert on linguistic policies. What I would like to do is to recall the context in which these questions are posed. What do Canadians think of this? What do Canadians think of bilingualism? What about our situation? So I should be able to illustrate what I'm saying. Let's look at the screen.
Tout le monde voit?
Can everybody see my screen? Perfect. Okay, what I wanted to do first, as I said before, wanted to give an idea about the context in which we have this debate. And then I wanted to refer to this Confederation of Tomorrow project. This is a pan-Canadian survey covering about 5,000 people. And there is this autochthonous sample, which is fairly important within this. We can therefore have an interesting point of view, whether it be a newspaper or. So this is important, especially for autochthonous people. So this project is the collaboration with the RRPP and Canada West Foundation and others. So this is the context. What is important? Let's start with the Quebec. Where the French language seems to be in a safe environment. So how do they perceive the French language? This is also interesting to look at the question as follows. Is the French language in Quebec threatened? So this is evolving constantly. It's been evolving over the last few years. So it's about 68%, majority of French-speaking Quebec people believe so. So what is interesting is also to compare this with what is outside Quebec. How do the English speakers perceive the health of the French language in and out of Quebec? So here again, it's interesting to look at what is optimistic and what is pessimistic. So, is the French language threatened in Quebec? So the answer is yes, at 71%, no, 34%. When you look at the Anglophones, you see clearly that 70% is no, French is not threatened. So this is when you refer to Law 95. For several English speakers in Quebec and elsewhere, the French language in Quebec is not threatened. Now, what about in outside Quebec? Results are not really different for Quebec people and Francophone in Quebec. It is 71%, as you can see in the diagram. When you look at what is happening outside Quebec, a majority is considering that French is not threatened, even outside Quebec. So it is in this context that we have to look at the surprise situation. We have the majority, 53% of Canadians outside Quebec, who don't consider that French outside Quebec is threatened. So this is, of course, an impression we have. And of course, there is the political debate, which is going to focus on this aspect. Now, in the Miranda paper, we find some interesting statements, and I would add that it's interesting to look at what was in the paper of Mario Regardez. So this shows that the French language has evolved. The Anglophones in Quebec do not believe that the French language is threatened.
Officielle apprise, les données auraient peut-être été un petit peu différentes.
Here the terms are a little bit different, native language, first language, but here we're talking about native language and the language spoken at home, and we can see the trend is downwards. So the status of the French language, whether that is within Quebec or outside of it, has been changing. As for Indigenous languages, and I would like to thank Miranda and Linda for the incredible work they've done, because I have a lot of questions for you based on the polls I've been studying about Indigenous languages. And I think that the same questions come up in a lot of different surveys. We asked respondents about how important their language was for their personal identity. And what we can see here is among Inuit communities, or for Inuit people, the language was very important for their sense of identity. 70%, which is very, very high. And it was 53% for other Indigenous groups. And those are people and that's not even people who speak necessarily their languages. The percentage of people who do speak the languages, that's a small number, but it was over 80, 90% who said that that language was important for their identity. So this really adds a lot to the discussion around Indigenous languages and the construction of identity. So these polls show us that the public opinion is quite favorable to language protection, especially within the context of reconciliation. People want to be open to reconciliation. And there's a direct link with languages, especially the space given to Indigenous languages. And we asked, is the government far from or not very far from reconciliation? And we ask that question every year. And here you have results from 2022, which have just been published. And people say that the government has not yet gone far enough in terms of reconciliation. And that number is going up, going up. It was 36% in January 2020 and has risen 10% to 46% by January 2022 of people saying that the government has not gone far enough to advance reconciliation. So I think that this shows there's a lot of appetite for more protections for Indigenous languages. And then here you see the difference between the Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. Indigenous people are more likely to say the government has not gone far enough. But even among non-Indigenous people, the rate has gone from 34% in 2020 to 44% in 2022. Everyone thinks that the government has not gone far enough to advance reconciliation. And this tells me there really is a lot of support for protecting and defending Indigenous languages. So that was the context I wanted to give you. The debate, or the context in which this debate evolves. I now have a few questions for you. And I don't know if you can answer directly, or maybe these are good future research questions. But in their presentation, Miranda and Linda talked about the linguistic regime in Canada. And how would you, though, describe or define this linguistic regime? In just a few words. And this is across Canada, but do we need more concentrated efforts? Do we need to do a little bit more to improve intergovernmental relationships on these issues? Do there need to be better vertical relationships with the federal government, especially in terms of protecting Indigenous languages? And maybe we could have a more focused approach on these issues. What do you think? And then my other question about Indigenous languages is, while French does have some protections, Indigenous languages require not only protection, but also revitalization. So yes, we want to protect them, but we also want to revitalize them. So what does that mean for the policies that we are going to put into place? Are there different challenges for Indigenous languages than there were for French? And you did speak about this a bit in your presentation, but I was wondering if you could speak a little more about the cooperation that could be done between French-speaking linguistic minorities and Indigenous language minorities. I think it could be fruitful. And then finally, it's the question that's always there in the background, especially when we're talking about French, and is that, is Quebec an ally or no? We get the impression that when Quebec acts within its own territory, as with Law 113, it can sometimes harm linguistic minorities outside of Quebec, elsewhere in Canada. We saw it this morning even, with an article questioning the Trudeau government's willingness to protect English speakers in Quebec. So when Quebec acts on these issues and acts to protect French speakers within its territory, sometimes that has negative repercussions for French speakers outside of Quebec. So what is Quebec's role in all of this? Is it an ally or no? So these are maybe more comments than questions, some of them, but I'm hoping we can get into more of a debate or answer some of the questions from the audience. Once again, thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate being here with you all. Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Before we hear some of the questions from the audience,
to say a few words, and he, I think, also has a question. Leslie.
Yes, thank you, Graham, and thank you to the presenters and Charles. Linda mentioned that the Forum of Federations had created a space for debating and studying these issues in a comparative context, and I've been fortunate enough to be directing the project. I developed it in collaboration with colleagues at the Forum of Federations and with an advisory committee of 3 scholars, and Linda is one of the members of that advisory committee, and we are going to ideally cover 11 countries by the end of the project. We published 4 papers to date. The first one is on Nepal, the world's youngest federation, which also claims to have something like 123 languages. The second one was on Belgium, and I count this paper as actually 2 papers because there's a French version, but anyway, that's the third country, and the other countries range from India to Switzerland to South Africa to Ethiopia. So if you're interested in these questions in a comparative sense, I encourage you to watch on the Forum of Federations website. The papers are not just descriptive. Obviously, the authors need to provide basic information about whether there are official languages and at which levels of government there are, how many there are, what does this mean? Is it just simply a symbolic recognition? And how do these languages, how are they applied in public services, for example, in education, which is turning out to be one of the more interesting fields in the series. And we've asked authors particularly to look at current issues and debates and reform proposals, and to try to give it an idea of whether there are changes on the horizon. Obviously, this varies from one country to another. Canada is in the middle of a very fertile period. Before I ask question, I just want to briefly commend Linda and Miranda on the paper. It was a huge pleasure to work with you, not only because of the quality of the research, but because you've done something pioneering. And people who know me well know that I don't toss bouquets at people easily. It's pioneering in the sense that just as in public policy and constitutional debates, it took us a long time to get out of the silos, and we're still not out of them. And I speak as a former federal public servant, but silos were also present in research, and indeed still are, because there are questions of who should be doing research and writing on which questions and so on, which are entirely valid ones. But you have done something remarkable in the sense that not only is there a huge amount of information, it's up to date, but you've also shown that there are some parallels in the struggles and the campaigns for the recognition of official languages and Indigenous languages, and that there is a huge interaction with federalism. Federalism can be an encouragement to a certain amount of progress and emulation in public policy, but it also can allow certain governments that are not particularly willing to go along with others that are more willing to sit back and do less than some people might like them to do. Okay, I do have a question. Here it is. In a recent Globe and Mail editorial just a couple of days ago, the conclusion states that Bill C-13, the Official Languages Reform Bill, that's now before Parliament, will, and this is the verb they use, will suppress English in Quebec. And so I'd invite particularly Linda, but Miranda also, to respond. Is there anything to this, or is this a kind of a rhetorical flourish to close an editorial?
Miranda, you want to go first? Veux-tu parler en premier, ou si tu veux que je...
I think I'll let you start, and I'll add a footnote at the end.
En fait, il y a beaucoup de questions.
Yes. Charles' presentation brought up many good questions. And it's a little frustrating to get all these good questions right at the end. And honestly, it's impossible that anyone thinks that English is going to disappear. This law will, maybe give more prevalence to French, but it will in no way eliminate English. English is very popular in Canada and in Quebec. It's very widely used. And the rate of bilingualism amongst French speakers is very high and getting higher between French and English. Everything depends on what lens you're using to look at this question. It's actually quite an incendiary argument. There's the Quebec Community Network of Anglophones in Quebec, and they have led the charge against this law from the beginning because they think it attacks equality. But as we've heard, these same concepts go back to the Commission on Biculturalism and Bilingualism. And French is a co-official language with English in Canada, and it's up to individuals which language they will prefer. So these linguistic issues are present across Canada, but French is more than a communication tool. It's also part of people's identity. And French is a language that people want to strengthen within a certain part of our territory. across Canada, we've always seen this strategy, especially from English-speaking communities. And we've always had people saying we need to protect and promote French in Canada. And as for Indigenous languages, I hope that we can protect them and revitalize them. And to put English on the same level as these other languages when it's the most widely spoken language in the country, I think that's a little disingenuous. And it definitely is not coming from a reconciliation approach or mindset. Rather, it's coming from a mindset that is ignoring the situation on the ground where English is getting more and more popular across the country. And we've really got to make the difference between the two. I would like to come back to, it's always been the same thing. Since the beginning of the debates around the new law on official languages, there are people defending the English-speaking population in Quebec. There always are. But when you look at the bill, it reaffirms the formal legality, co-legality of French and English. It reaffirms the legality of these two languages and as well as linguistic minorities. And I also saw that someone said, a certain Anglophone group from Quebec said that the bill would modify the Constitution, and that is not at all the case.
Modification constitutionnelle, mais certainement pas le projet de loi C13. On en veut, en milieu anglophone, je pense, à l'idée de principes différents.
So the idea is there because the principle of formal equality is important because it means that English is still dominating. So now there is a will to equilibrate the two sides. French is perhaps threatening more because it is creating obligations vis-à-vis the English-speaking persons working in the public service. And that's why we don't see French as an invasive language. And we know that there is no possibility to do without these obligations. So what is described is certainly repeated by many media players.
This issue, and it's, the English language minority isn't key to what concerns me, and both with C13 and with the renewal of the Official Languages Act, the problem there is that it ignores the consultation with Indigenous peoples. And so you have elements such as, little footnotes acknowledging existing rights of Crees and the Innu, but it ignores the other populations, Indigenous populations in Quebec. So, for example, where it becomes very complex is with places like Ganawage and the folk there who are primarily Anglo and who are focused on language revitalization of their own language, who have their own schools that are trilingual and who are working in a different way. If you establish these laws without consulting, and also the Huron-Wendat, who are at a significant crisis point with their language. If you don't consult these peoples so that this law is created without them, then you're creating those barriers. You're creating further complications to language revitalization, the programs, how we establish our schools, and so on and so forth. And also even having Indigenous languages in the schools, even as a potential of having spaces where students can learn their language in immersion schools, for example. This becomes very problematic under these laws without having proper consultation and dealing with these problems at the front end. So that's my frustration with this legislation, not so much that we're going to lose English in those areas. So that's its own discussion.
Thank you. J'ai une question maintenant de Serge Quinté de la FCFA.
I have a question for CFA. How do the French clientele can better use their political or public voice in order to support the implementation of the law on autochthonous languages?
Shall I start with this one, Linda?
Why don't you start with that, Miranda?
Yeah, so there's plenty of areas of support, and we worked with FCFA when we were developing the Indigenous Languages Act, and fantastic allies. And part of that is having these conversations. And when we look at these press points, these hot topics, it's always oh, there's so many languages, and how will we there's this putting Indigenous languages, well, as Linda brought up earlier, at odds with French minority language communities, which isn't the case. And one of the things that we actually need to think about is Canada, pre-contact, was a multilingual country with people who were multilingual. North America, as a norm, has decided that it wants to be monolingual or potentially bilingual, but the reality is that most of the world, the people are multilingual, and so this idea that we need to be fighting with each other really is absolutely ridiculous. And so, how do you become allies? And how do you support the Indigenous Languages Act? First, with new legislation, with French supporting legislation, ensure that Indigenous peoples are at the table in consulting. Looking towards languages in the community, looking towards languages in the schools, and creating space for Indigenous languages in those spaces, and working together in partnership. With this paper, we've really started to pull little bits of understanding of the interrelatedness of our struggles with keeping our languages safe, keeping our culture safe. And those conversations are so critical. We had conversations with FCFA in the development of the Act when we were talking about our strategies for getting our needs seen within this legislation. And FCFA created areas of public sharing where they spoke to their support for the legislation, where they talked about their processes as well. And so that collaboration was wonderfully helpful, I think mutually. So it's just finding those opportunities to understand that we're not so different and our struggles are very similar, and lifting each other up, as opposed to buying into the rhetoric that there's only so much support that can go for only a few languages.
Thank you, Miranda. J'ai une question en français qui va un peu dans le même sens.
I have a question in French that goes along that idea. How could our government support initiatives of Francophone organizations and autochthone organizations at local level? Beautiful question. I think that following what Miranda said, we could easily create meeting spots, some sort of common ground with the autochthone people and Francophone people in order to ensure the linguistic continuity. And I would say every project should be prone for learning languages and for maintaining this continuity. I think this would be already a winning strategy. On the other hand, we can have several circles that will allow people to meet together, to talk together, and to put forward their personality. A language is a cultural value. We try to do this with other countries, and we do it rather well. Now, let's do that within ourselves, with ourselves. So let us heighten the awareness of our own people, and let us say that we have to take into consideration our responsibilities vis-à-vis the territories and also vis-à-vis the cultures. So we are in a society. When we talk about autochthonous languages, we are revitalizing the languages. We are trying to transmit them to the younger generation. In Francophone Ontario, we are trying to do the same thing. We try to integrate migrants. There are practices which need to be expanded so that we can work locally and value the language and the culture. So, learning French, learning autochthonous language, why not? So having linguistic mixes, why not? We may have autochthonous and francophone so that we can think differently. I think AFCFA and the organizations, local organizations, should meet more often and should launch games to be at the same time an opportunity. So those are great options from a linguistic point of view. So our major vector is education. Thank you very much. To conclude, I would like to thank the organizers, but also Nina and Miranda.
Discussion which covered not only the evolution of language legislation, the various stages that were identified over the years, but also a refreshing context. C'est un contexte de rapprochement et de collaboration plutôt que de contestation.
Therefore, this has been an excellent opportunity. I think that it is obvious that there may be some key claims in the language areas, but I think we have reached a point where the discovery by Canadians, this has been demonstrated by surveys, a very keen interest in autochthonous languages. So we have to recognize what we have in common.
That this discussion displayed, and I think lays the groundwork for further discussion and further research about how to proceed so that we can reinforce the health of Canadian languages. So thank you to everybody for participating, but particularly to Linda and Miranda for this rich piece of research and synthesis of a detailed and complex situation.
Recording stopped.